My mother walked into my surgical clinic on a Tuesday morning like she owned the place. She had my younger brother beside her, dressed in a blazer he clearly borrowed from someone, and a folder tucked under his arm like he was about to pitch something. I was standing at the reception desk reviewing a patient's pre-op notes when I heard the front door open. I looked up. My mother made eye contact with me, smiled that particular smile she has, the one that never reaches her eyes, and said, loud enough for my receptionist and two patients in the waiting room to hear, "We need to talk about your future." I hadn't spoken to her in 14 months. Let me tell you how we got here. I grew up in Barrie, Ontario, the oldest of three. My mother had always made it clear that my brother Callum was the one with potential. He was charming, funny. He lit up a room in a way I never did. I was quiet, studious, the one who stayed in on weekends to study while Callum went to parties and came home smelling like someone else's basement. My father worked at a plant until it closed, then drove for a transport company until his back gave out. Money was tight, but not desperate. We were fine. We were ordinary. What wasn't ordinary was the way my mother spoke about Callum versus me. When Callum failed grade 11 chemistry for the second time, my mother told the school the teacher had it out for him. When I won a provincial science award at 16, she said the judges probably didn't have many good applicants that year. When I got into medicine at McMaster, she nodded and said, "Well, at least that's something." I stopped waiting for her to be proud of me sometime around my second year of residency. It was easier that way. I did my surgical residency at Hamilton General, then completed a fellowship in orthopedic surgery in Calgary. I moved back to Ontario afterward, not to Barrie, to Oakville, and joined a small but well-regarded orthopedic practice. Within 3 years, I had bought out one of the retiring partners. By the time I was 31, my name was on the door. Lennox Orthopedics, my name. Built from nothing but early mornings, night calls, and the kind of exhaustion that becomes so familiar you stop noticing it. Callum, meanwhile, had spent those same years drifting. He'd started a landscaping company that folded after one season. He'd taken an online business certificate that he referenced constantly but never seemed to use. He'd worked for a buddy's renovation company for a while, then stopped when they had some kind of falling out. He was 34 and living in a rental in Innisfil with his girlfriend, doing odd jobs and talking about his next big idea, the way some people talk about the weather. Constant, automatic, never leading anywhere. I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because it matters to what happened next. My mother called me in March of that year, about 16 months after we'd last spoken. Our estrangement hadn't been dramatic. No screaming fight, no ultimatum. It had been a slow erosion. A birthday dinner where she spent the whole meal talking about Callum's landscaping venture while I'd just closed my first acquisition. A Christmas where she asked me if I was still doing the surgery thing, in a tone that made it sound like a phase I might grow out of. Then a conversation the previous November where she told me that I'd become cold and money obsessed and that my success had changed me. I put the phone down and just not picked it back up. Not out of anger, out of tiredness. So when she called in March, I almost didn't answer. I did, because part of me is still that 16-year-old hoping for something. She was warm, warmer than usual. She asked about the clinic, said she'd heard it was doing well, from whom I didn't ask. She said she missed me. She said the family felt fragmented and that she wanted us to sit down together. I told her I was open to that. We agreed to dinner at her house in 2 weeks. I should have noticed that she asked me to keep it low-key, just family, and specifically not to mention it to my colleague Marcus, who was also a close friend and who happened to know a fair amount about my practice's finances. I thought she was just being private. I didn't think about why. Dinner was awkward the way all those reunions are. Too much food, too much talking around things. Callum was there with his girlfriend. My mother had made her potato leek soup, which I still love despite everything. For about 40 minutes, I thought maybe I'd been too hard on her. Maybe this was just what repair looked like, imperfect and a bit stiff but real. Then my mother set down her spoon and said, "We've been doing a lot of thinking. Callum wants to get into healthcare administration, and we think your clinic would be the perfect place for him to start." I looked at Callum. He was looking at the table. I asked what she meant by healthcare administration. My mother said a leadership role, something with real decision-making authority, a directorship, or we were thinking, a co-director position. I asked Callum directly, what's your background in healthcare? He said he'd been reading about it. He said he understood business fundamentals. He said he'd shadowed a physiotherapist once for a week, back in 2019. I told them as calmly as I could that a surgical practice wasn't a small business that you could step into without credentials, that the regulatory environment alone, the CPSO, the college requirements, the liability structure, meant that any administrative director would need to understand the clinical side of the operation, not just the numbers, that I had a practice manager with 15 years of experience who handled operations, that there was no position to give. My mother said, "You could create one." I said, "I won't." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You've always been selfish, Avery. You've always kept everything for yourself." I drove back to Oakville that night thinking it was over. Just a dinner that went badly. I'd handled worse. I was wrong. The first thing I noticed, about 3 weeks later, was that a patient called to cancel their post-op appointment and mentioned, awkwardly, that they'd heard some concerns about the clinic. I asked what concerns. They said a friend had told them something about billing irregularities. I told them there were no billing irregularities and offered to walk them through our OHIP submissions personally. They rebooked. Then a second patient mentioned something similar, different wording, same vague anxiety. Then one of my referring physicians, a GP in Burlington who sent me maybe a dozen patients a year, emailed to say he'd received an anonymous letter about my practice and wanted to know if everything was all right. I asked him to forward it. The letter alleged that I had been double billing OHIP, that a former staff member had been dismissed for raising concerns, and that the clinic had been flagged by the college. None of it was true. Not a word of it. We had a clean billing record, our last college inspection had been without findings, and we had never dismissed anyone for raising concerns. The one staff departure we'd had in the past year was a receptionist who'd relocated to BC for her partner's job and had given me a card on her last day. But the letters were specific enough to sound credible, and they were going to the right people, referring physicians, not patients, which meant whoever wrote them understood how referral-based practices actually worked. I'm not someone who panics. 14 years of surgical training does something to your relationship with panic. You learn to set it aside and think. So I thought. The letter had my clinic's correct OHIP billing number in it. That number is not publicly available. The only people outside my practice who knew that number were my accountant, my previous business partner who'd retired, and my mother, who had once helped me fill out a form when I first registered years ago and who I had foolishly never thought to revoke access from on one of my old administrative email accounts. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Her name was Claire, and she was the kind of person who listened without interrupting and took notes in a way that made you feel like nothing you said was going to be wasted. I walked her through everything. She said, "Before we do anything else, we document." So we did. Screenshots, forwarded emails, timestamps, the referral from the GP in Burlington, the cancellation call, all of it. Then I called my clinic's IT consultant and had him do a full audit of who had accessed my old administrative account and when. It had been accessed twice in the past 6 weeks, from an IP address registered to a residence in Innisfil. I sat with that for a while. Here's what I want to say about that moment. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something older and quieter. It was the feeling of having suspected something for 20 years and finally holding the proof of it in your hands. Not relief, not vindication, just a kind of settling, like a building finally coming to rest on its foundation. I didn't call my mother. I didn't call him. I called Claire back and told her what the IT audit had found. She said we had enough to proceed with a formal complaint to the police and a civil claim. She also recommended contacting OHIP's fraud prevention unit myself proactively to put my account on record as the target of a false complaint rather than the subject of one. That call took 20 minutes. The investigator I spoke with was thorough and almost immediately said they'd seen this pattern before. Competitors or disgruntled parties filing false tips to trigger audits and drain a practice's time. I followed Claire's advice exactly. What I didn't do was warn anyone that it was coming. About 6 weeks after that dinner, I got a call from my mother. She said she wanted to apologize for how the conversation had gone. She said she'd been emotional and that she'd been under a lot of stress. She said Callum was struggling and she just wanted to help him. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "Has anything strange been going on at the clinic?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Oh, just sometimes these things happen in small businesses. Complaints, misunderstandings. I just want to make sure you're okay." I said, "Everything's fine, Mom. Thanks for asking." 3 days later, she called again. This time, she was more direct. She said she'd been thinking about it more and that she still believed the role for Callum at the clinic made sense. She said he was willing to start small. She said he could work in patient coordination and then grow into a directorship over time. She used the phrase sweat equity in a way that suggested she didn't entirely know what it meant. I said, "Mom, I need to ask you something directly." She said, "Of course." I said, "Did you or Callum access my old administrative email account in the past 2 months?" There was a pause that lasted maybe 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time in a conversation. Then she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I said, "Okay," and I ended the call. Claire had already filed the police report by then. The civil claim was ready to go. What we were waiting for was the OHIP investigation to complete its preliminary review, because Claire wanted everything coordinated so that my mother and Callum couldn't later claim the civil suit was retaliatory. The OHIP unit concluded their preliminary review 9 days later. They found no evidence of billing irregularities on my end, which I'd known they would, and flagged the anonymous complaint as potentially fraudulent. They referred it to their fraud investigation team. That referral, combined with the police report and the IP address audit, was what Claire had been waiting for. The civil notice went out on a Wednesday. My mother called me within the hour. She was crying. She said I was destroying the family. She said she had never done anything to hurt me, that I had always been paranoid, that I had always looked for reasons to push them away. She said Callum was a good person who just needed a chance and that I was the only person in a position to give it to him, and I was choosing not to out of spite. I let her finish. Then I said, "Mom, I have the IP logs, I have the timestamps, I have the billing number that was in that letter, which is not publicly available. Claire has all of it. This is going to be handled through the courts now. If you want to talk to me after that, I'm open to it, but not before." She called 4 more times that evening. I didn't answer. My father called the next morning. He'd been largely absent from all of this. He knew what was happening, but he stayed quiet the way he'd always stayed quiet, that particular habit some men have of preserving peace by pretending not to see the fire. He said he hoped I'd reconsider. I told him I hadn't filed the civil claim to punish anyone. I'd filed it because my professional reputation had been targeted and I had a practice and a staff and patients who depended on me, and I wasn't willing to let that be dismantled because Callum needed a career handed to him. My father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were always the strong one." I didn't know if he meant it as a compliment or an explanation. The civil case settled before it reached discovery. Callum's girlfriend, who had a level head and no apparent interest in going down with a ship she hadn't built, reportedly encouraged him to settle early. The terms included a written acknowledgement of the conduct, a payment that covered my legal costs, and a portion of the revenue I'd lost from the referring physician in Burlington, who'd quietly reduced his referrals during the period of uncertainty, and a commitment to no further contact with my professional accounts or correspondence. I never saw the inside of a courtroom. What I did see was Callum, about 2 months after the settlement, at a grocery store in Barrie when I was visiting a friend. He was in the cereal aisle. He looked at me and then looked away. He didn't speak. I didn't either. I bought what I came for and left. My mother sent me a card at Christmas. It was one of those generic cards from the drugstore, the kind with a snowy scene on the front and a printed verse inside. She'd written, below the verse, in her handwriting, "I hope you're well. I'm sorry things turned out this way." I sat with that card for a long time. I thought about the 16-year-old me who would have cried over it, who would have called back, apologized for something she hadn't done, and spent another decade trying to fit into a space that was never made for her. I put the card in the recycling. My clinic finished that fiscal year up 18%. My practice manager got a bonus. I hired a third surgeon. I started mentoring a resident from Toronto Western who reminds me a little of myself at that age. Serious, a bit isolated, working twice as hard as everyone around her to prove something she shouldn't have to prove. I don't think about my mother every day. Some days I don't think about her at all. That's not coldness. That's not selfishness. That's just what it looks like when you finally stop trying to earn something that was never going to be given to you. The morning after my mother walked into my clinic, the day after that Tuesday, after I'd had my receptionist politely ask them to leave, after I'd finished my afternoon surgeries and driven home through that particular flat gray October light that Ontario does so well, I stood in my kitchen and made tea and looked out at my backyard and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Quiet, just quiet. The kind that doesn't need anything from you. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from working hard, but from spending years trying to be enough for people who had already decided you weren't. I know that exhaustion well. I carried it through medical school, through residency, through every milestone that my mother met with a shrug, and my brother met with indifference. And what I've come to understand, looking back at everything that happened, is that the way things ended wasn't random. It wasn't luck. It was the result of choices, theirs and mine. My mother made a choice over and over across many years to invest her belief in Callum while treating my achievements as incidental. That choice didn't just shape how I grew up, it shaped who Callum became. When you tell someone consistently that the rules don't quite apply to them, that effort is optional, that credentials can be substituted by charm, that someone else will eventually open the door, you're not helping them. You're quietly building a ceiling they don't even know is there. Callum didn't walk into my clinic that Tuesday because he was malicious at his core. He walked in because he'd been raised to believe that proximity to success was the same as earning it. That's not a small misunderstanding. That's not a small misunderstanding. That's a failure of character that took decades to construct. What protected me wasn't luck, and it wasn't anger. It was something I'd built slowly and without fanfare, a habit of thinking clearly even when things were personal. When the false complaints started appearing, I didn't spiral. I documented. I called Claire. I contacted OHIP myself before anyone could get ahead of me. Every step I took was deliberate because I had learned, through training, through years of being the person in the room who couldn't afford to panic, that your mind is the one thing no one can tamper with if you refuse to let them. That clarity, that insistence on thinking before reacting, is what turned a frightening situation into a manageable one. And then there's the harder thing, the thing I still sit with sometimes. I could have responded to my mother's dinner invitation with suspicion. I could have closed the door before she even had a chance to open it. I didn't, because I still believe that people could choose better. That belief cost me some legal fees and a few months of stress. But I don't regret it because the alternative, becoming someone who preemptively assumes the worst of everyone, would have cost me something harder to recover. There's a kind of integrity in keeping your heart open, just enough, even when experience argues against it, while keeping your eyes open fully. Those two things aren't in conflict. They're both necessary. What I want, for anyone who recognizes something of themselves in this story, is for you to understand that the quiet work is what matters. Not the confrontation, not the moment the investigator called, not the settlement. What mattered was every morning I showed up to my clinic and did the job well. Every patient I looked after. Every decision I made that I could stand behind. That accumulation of honest work, of sound judgment, of refusing to collapse under pressure, is what made everything else possible. It doesn't make a dramatic story, but it makes a life you can actually live in. The card my mother sent at Christmas is in the recycling. My clinic is growing, and I am, for the first time in a long time, not waiting for anyone's approval to feel like enough.